I did a video last week about accepting responsibility when it comes to trauma and trigger responses. People find it real difficult to do. It is extremely difficult. When you get triggered from a trauma response, it's not what's really happening now, it's just your body reaction to something really familiar from a long time ago. And there's a crucial moment after you get triggered to not react. And that's the part that is most difficult when you're in a conversation or an event or something happens where we have this little part inside of us, like people who do not feel good about themselves in many ways. The small parts of us that we do feel really good about ourselves are so protected that we feel we have very little, that nobody's allowed to approach that part of us that we just build a fortress around. So when we get triggered and that part of us feels threatened, our initial reaction is just to push back, to put blame on somebody else, because if it's your fault, I have no more responsibility in it, and then it takes me out of my feelings. It never feels good to be triggered, but if we keep responding with blame and pushing back on somebody else, we're just taking ourselves out of the feelings that we need to feel, process, grieve, and release. So the pushback takes the responsibility from us figuring out what our triggers are and puts it on the other person so that they don't act that way again towards us because we can't handle the feelings. But it's not the other person's responsibility to take care of our emotional needs and our emotional triggers. It's ours. We were just never taught how to do it. And I'm sure most of what was modeled for you was people blaming and pushing back. When you were younger and you evoked a reaction out of somebody because you triggered them, they pushed back on you, so you learned that that was the appropriate response. It's really difficult when somebody triggers you, especially when you care about somebody, not to push back, because you don't want to hurt. You don't want to feel those feelings. Those feelings are so intense, and we're so protective of that place inside of us. We have to learn how to sit with and deal with those feelings. I was never really good at not reacting quickly. It usually takes me, it could take an hour, a day, a week, a month, a year, depending on the person and the trigger, for me to actually process it and get over the grieving and the hurt, where I take full responsibility for it. The problem is, in the meantime, you're losing people in your life, and sometimes you get so far away from them because you've pulled back from that trigger or you put blame on them that you don't know how to go back in that vulnerable, humble state and just say, I'm sorry. I was out of my mind. You triggered something that I was not aware of, and I would like to make it up to you. Sometimes the damage is just too great to go back. So narrowing the gap between the time you get the response and processing it, and then getting back to the other person and hopefully having that conversation about it, gets shorter and shorter. It would be much easier to become vulnerable and have the conversation with the person explaining why you got triggered, and it had nothing to do with them and it had to do all with you. But to become vulnerable is that weakened place, that place of vulnerability where you're giving away so much of your power because you don't even understand why you had that reaction. If we can cut the time down and figure out what these reactions are and why, we could have those conversations when they come up instead of having to withdraw and remove people from your life so that you can heal and process it. I just wish that time was shorter for me, and it gets shorter each time. And the thing that I realized with my recent trigger was that it had nothing to do with me. This person was just living their life. They said something that set me off, and they didn't even know that I had the reaction. I felt miserable and worthless, and my energy was completely zapped for a couple of days. And I wanted to put it back on them, but I just couldn't. And the process of sitting with those uncomfortable feelings for as long as I've been sitting with them and practicing them, that person never realized that I did have a reaction, that I did have the trigger, and as far as they know, everything was fine and is fine. I wish I had done that sooner in a lot of relationships, and I owe a good amount of apologies going backwards. I'm just trying to figure out how to go back to those people and apologize. And I don't know if it's selfish or not. You know, I want to take away their pain and their hurt, but I'm also wanting to take mine away as well because of how I feel about the way I reacted. So I'm still figuring out how selfish or unselfish that is. And the thought of going to a place and being vulnerable and apologizing and telling that person, you know, all of the things that I'm not proud of and the things that I am embarrassed about of how I acted. When you're that vulnerable, going to that place, the last thing you want is a negative reaction or rejection coming back. So for me, that's the process, is realizing what the triggers are, not reacting and putting it on the other person, sitting with those feelings, as painful and as difficult as it is, processing them, accepting my responsibility in the reaction, and then going back and explaining, apologizing, and making the other person understand that it had nothing to do with them. I think the big thing in my head, besides waiting for that rejection to come back, where it's like, no, it's not acceptable. The apology is, I never want anybody to have to change because of what happened to me and why I react the way I do. So I never know how to approach it with them. Because if I tell them what it is and why it is, even though it has nothing to do with them, they're going to have to, if they care about you, they're probably going to want to alter who they are. And, you know, I've altered my life so much for the people around me that I never want to put that on anybody else. And that's why I usually withdraw. And it's not fair to the other person. So I got to find the courage and the strength to explain those parts of me that I protect, why I protect them, and why it's hard for me to tell people what they are, because I don't want it used against me, and I don't want them to have to change to make it easier on me. It's not for them to do the work to make it easier on me. It's for me to do the work to make it easier on myself. So I guess that's it. Try to not react when you get those triggers. Try to sit with those feelings and just allow them to be. And if you allow them to be, you will find your way to what they really are. If you have any comments or questions, leave them below, and I hope you guys have a great day. Thanks. Bye-bye.